I did a video recently asking if angels have visited us, and I recounted the wealth of evidence that they indeed have. In this video, though, I want to look at a darker reality, and I'm going to be drawing on the many accounts in this marvellous book, Encountering Mystery, by Professor Dale Allison, who I had the privilege of interviewing just a few weeks ago on Blogging Theology. He's a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary in the United States. And at the end of this, I'm going to look at what Islam teaches, what the Qur'an and the Hadith say about Shaitan, as he's known, Satan, and demons. So I'm going to be reading from page 38 of this book, where he writes, "Unfortunately, religious experiences are not all sweetness and light. The religious experiences of love have an evil counterpart. It is the overwhelming horror, the unparalleled terror, not unease or a sense of the uncanny, but true terror that inexplicably arrives from nowhere. In this experience, terror is not an emotional response to some proximate perceptible cause, like a grizzly bear or an enemy combatant or a car on the wrong side of a highway, but a reaction to a perplexing and menacing enigma. I first thought about the experience of unprovoked, overwhelming horror a few decades ago when I happened upon a first-person narrative with the title Dance of the Leaves. Sounds like a horror film. In this, a certain Robert Harner tells of what happened to him on November the 18th, 1975. While driving to give a lecture, he found himself with some extra time and decided to stop at Serpent Mount in southern Ohio. The effigy mound, the world's largest, is shaped like a winding snake and runs over 1,300 feet. After parking his car, Harner strolled around the monument. He found himself wholly alone. After a few minutes pondering who built the mound and why, and nobody really knows, he began to return to his car. While walking back, this happened." And Dale Allison quotes, "Suddenly, and without warning, I was struck with the coldest, most abject, hopeless terror I have ever experienced. I felt the hair rising on the nape of my neck. I could neither move nor speak. I knew that although I was completely alone, I was not really alone. I saw nothing, I heard nothing, but I felt such horror as I had never experienced before. In broad, open sunlight, I came close to fainting for the first time in my life. I made a futile attempt to be logical. I thought of all the reasons why I should not be frightened. It did no good." End quote. At this juncture, the narrative takes a truly fantastic turn, writes Dale Allison. Harner claims that although there was no wind, some of the leaves on the ground began to move in little footfalls toward him until they surrounded him. Although this amplified his terror, he was likewise fascinated and so decided, this was before the ubiquitous smartphone, to return to his car for his camera. With that thought, the spell was broken. The spectacle ended. Regarding the second part of Harner's story, a skeptic might suppose that, despite his adamant insistence to the contrary, his imagination got the better of him. He turned a trick of the wind into an imagined pattern. Regrettably, I do not know Mr. Harner, who may or may not yet live. I have been unable to review the matter with him. Regarding the first part of his story, however, I take him at his word. This is because his report, prior to the affair of the leaves, contains nothing idiosyncratic. Multitudes have reported that, for no apparent reason and without warning of any kind, utter horror descended upon them from out of the blue. Among them is one of my children. Not long ago, after he shared with me a disturbing event, I asked him to write it up. This is from the email he sent me in response. And Dale then quotes from the email. I had just come to bed. I recall lying on my back for what seemed only a few minutes. I suddenly had a feeling of deep dread, so I sat up. Feelings of panic rushed into my body like electricity. I had been fine, and then I was filled with fear. I had a sense that a presence was in the left corner of my bedroom. I felt overwhelmed, and that this presence was emanating hate, rage, and violence towards me. At this time, I had not lifted up my head to look towards it because I had been too frightened to do so. I centered myself as best I could, then was able to glance quickly in the direction of the corner, but immediately had to look away. During this glance, I was able to discern only a few white streaks of light, a lot like if you were to move your eyes around quickly when glancing at a street light. I centered myself for a few moments more until I was able to look up again. This time, I was able to look directly at it for a second or two. What I saw was a dark outline of an ape-like being. I could make out a squatted and hunched over body covered entirely in coarse fur or quills with long ape-like arms. It was too dark to tell if the fur or quills were black or if the colour was just hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out a face except searing white eyes that stared back at me. There were two sets of eyes, one stacked upon top of the other and overlapping slightly like a misregistered print. One had two very small grey streaky irises, maybe 1/3 the size of the average human iris. During the entire time the presence was in the room, it projected hate towards me. I felt strongly somehow that it was appearing to me as a warning. I remember hearing a voice that is very difficult to describe. It was both squeaky, deep, and hollow, all at the same time. I remember clearly that it said, "I will crush you," once, and then it was gone. Some of the dread kept returning back to me in momentary waves for the next couple of succeeding days, but that's really all I remember. End quote. And Dale Allison continues, when I spoke with my son about all this, I raised the possibility that the ape-like thing he saw was the projection of his imagination, that his pattern-making mind, searching for some cause of this terror, conjured an evil creature as explanation for his acute awareness of malevolence. He did not dismiss the idea. It's conceivable, he thought, that his imagination filled in a blank, that his mind, overcome with abject horror, desperately sought an explanation and, in response, manufactured a vision or succumbed to an illusion. Whether or not that is the truth, I take note that the terror was upon him before he looked around. Initially, he somehow sensed, without using his eyes, that an evil presence, a mysterious force off to his left, was directing hate and violence right at him. And then Dale continues, in talking about this event, I assured my son that what had happened to him was not rare. I had in mind experiences such as these. And then Dale then lists several short accounts, which I'm now going to read to you. The first account reads, I was out driving a dog cart with my father and driver. A call is made at a cottage above a wooded hollow, and for a while I am left alone with the old mare in the shafts. There comes an overwhelming sense of evil around me, and when the men return, they find me weeping bitterly. But it was not that I felt lonely or deserted. It was from the dread of some unseen force, which I did not attempt to explain, nor never have. And then the next quote. A year and a half ago, I was asleep in the night and woke very suddenly and felt quite alert. I felt surrounded and threatened by the most terrifying and powerful presence of evil. It seemed almost physical, and in a curious way it crackled, though not audibly. It was also extremely black, and I felt overwhelmed with terror. I felt it was a manifestation directed very personally at me by a power of darkness. I was overwhelmed by despair and a desire to go out and kill myself by jumping in the Thames nearby. That must be the River Thames here in London. But I knew that I must withstand this. And another account. We had all been travelling many hours and were hot, sticky and tired. On entering the room, I felt a most terrible chill, a fear I had never known. I am afraid I cannot put into words what exactly I felt, only to say that some terrible presence was in this room. On the bedside table beside me was a Bible. Although I am of the Jewish faith and not religious, this, even so, made me feel at that time very close to God. The Bible made me feel strong and made me feel that whatever was in the room, I could fight, and that God would fight alongside me. And another account. And this one is particularly interesting, and I'm going to mention its connection with a hadith, actually. Somewhat prematurely, I'm going to leave the Islamic perspective towards the end, but I just really want to pinpoint a word that's used here, which really struck me, but I'll come to that now. Suddenly, I became aware of a sense of the uttermost evil, so much so that I became awake. I could feel this sense of evil enveloping me. I had the terrifying impression that this evil force or presence was bent upon taking possession of me. How does one describe evil? I only knew that I was enveloped by this revolting force, so vile and rotting that I could almost taste the evil. Now I'm going to pause here with this account. He's just used a very important word. He talks about the evil, how to describe it, vile and rotting. And this word rotting just sent an alarm bell off in my mind because I'm aware of an hadith which uses exactly the same vocabulary to describe evil, remarkably. And I'll just read this short hadith, an authentic hadith. Uthman came to the Prophet, upon whom be peace, and said, O Messenger of Allah, Satan interferes between me, my prayer, and my recitation, confusing me. The Prophet said, such is Satan, who is called rotten. When you sense him, then seek refuge in Allah from him and puff to your left 3 times. Uthman said, I did so, and Allah took him away from me. So such is Satan, says the Prophet, who is called rotten. Okay, the sense of decaying flesh, this horrible stench. And it's the very word rotting, it's used here in this person's extraordinary encounter with this evil force. So just remarkable correspondence I just noticed as I was reading it. I'll just finish this brief story. I was enveloped by this revolting force, so vile and rotting, that I could almost taste the evil. I was in terror, so much so that I could not call out or move. A part of my mind told me that I must at all costs act, or I would be lost. I recall that I managed by a great effort to stretch out my right hand, and with my index finger I traced the shape of the cross in the air. Immediately on my doing this, the evil enveloping me fell away completely, and I felt a wonderful sense of peace and safety. And of course, Dale Allison is recounting these stories from the United States, where obviously culturally and religiously it's overwhelmingly Christian. And there are no accounts of Muslims anywhere in his book about anything, unfortunately. And then the last story he recounts, I was in a pleasant, relaxed frame of mind, my idle mind, my eyes shut when I was quite suddenly assaulted by a sense of evil. I opened my eyes to see if anyone had entered the compartment of the train, but it was empty. But for a single middle-aged man who seemed to be snoozing in the corner. I was filled with an indescribable feeling of mental revulsion. I wonder if there's rotting in the background there, and horror. But my mind seemed to work like that of a threatened animal as I tried to sense from where the threat came. You can imagine this guy like an animal, oh my God, seeking danger, seeking to survive in the face of this evil. I felt that my mind was threatened by some destructive force. I left the train and was aware that the evil was with me. I felt that I couldn't combat it. We didn't have the advantage of the prayer and the hadith and so on. By the end of 3 days, this horror had departed and the memory gradually became less vivid. But it was one of the most moving factors in my life. End quote. So then Dale comments, how widespread are these sorts of experiences? It's a really good question because they must be quite rare, surely. After all, in our modern materialist age where most people are moving away in the West anyway from organized religion, Christianity obviously, surely these experiences must be declining. People no longer believe in these things. He says, actually, they are exceedingly common. We know that 20% or more of the general population wakes up at least once in a lifetime with paralysis, and further that 3/4 of the time this is associated with a sense of a terrifying evil presence. This implies that at a minimum 15% of us run into a mystifying horror. The real number must be higher, given that evil presences do not confine themselves to episodes of sleep paralysis. He talks about this earlier in the book about sleep paralysis. They can also, as some of the stories just quoted reveal, disturb the wide awake. We also know that in the year 2000, the opinion research business, in cooperation with the BBC, reported that 25% of the population of the United Kingdom claimed to have been, on one or more occasions, aware of an evil presence. That's 1/4 of the population of the UK. That's millions and millions of people. As with most surveys, detailed follow-up will be needed to get beyond the broadest impression. Still, the high number is perhaps suggestive, remarkably suggestive, I would say. And then he continues, why have people, he says, in so many times and places believed in evil spirits or in outsized demonic figures such as the Christian Satan, the Buddhist Mara, or the Zoroastrian Angra Mainyu? Doesn't mention Islam again. There is no single or simple answer. A myriad of factors must be responsible. There is no one cause, however, has undoubtedly been the experience of transcendent evil. So it's not just the belief system of the people, whether it be Buddhists or Zoroastrian or Christians, that lead to this reality in their lives. It's actually the phenomenon, the religious experience itself, which bears witness to this reality. What is one to think after ostensibly encountering an invisible malignant presence? Asked Dale. Before the ubiquity of modern skepticism and the psychologizing of everything, most would reflexively have posited an external cause, goblins or demons or an evil ghost. As one modern sufferer said, and he quotes, if I were a religious man, I would certainly describe my experience as a contact with a god or devil, unquote. The traditional belief in evil spirits has had, apart from culture or religious tradition, a strong experiential source. So people believe in demons or evil either or partly because of their inherited religious tradition, be they Christians or Buddhists or Zoroastrians, or because they have actually experienced this. As non-religious people, like entirely secular people, they still encounter evil, the devil, demons, Satan, whatever you want to call him. The Religious Experience and Research Centre archives, he says, contain the following testimony. Quote, I felt the presence of such evil as I have never experienced before or since. I could neither see nor hear anything, only feel the presence of such evil. Looking back and knowing what I do now about the devil being a person and not a myth, as I thought in those days, I can well believe that it was a struggle on his part to regain my soul. End quote. Dale says, here belief in the devil as a myth has given way to belief in the devil as a person. And precisely because someone encountered an evil presence. So people have moved from seeing the devil as just a myth, an old wives' tale, whatever, to believing in the firm reality of the devil as an individual, as an entity, purely because of their experiences. Nothing to do with belief as such. And Dale says, I regard this change of mind as evidence for the proposition that some have believed in malevolent spirits because they have ostensibly run into them. So there's belief coming from experience, and there's belief coming from, the scriptures, whether it be the New Testament, the Old Testament, and so on. So he concludes the following, does Dale. At this point in Western history, many in the churches disbelieve in Satan as a personal being. And this is a remarkable statement. Is it true? I know this from my own experience. There is so much unbelief, unfortunately, in the Christian churches in the West, even about the existence of God sometimes, let alone about miracles, angels, demons, and so on. These are very doubted by many, many people at the highest levels, not just lay people, bishops, vicars, and so on as well. Dale says a major reason for this is that through the centuries, Satan, demons were invoked to explain all sorts of miserable things. Wars, epilepsy, earthquakes, lightning, temptation, schizophrenia, infertility, bad crops, crib death, sexual dreams, Tourette's syndrome, non-Christian religions, fatigue at midday. I didn't know that was a thing. The beliefs of heretics, for which we now have better explanations, says Dale, as if they were all now entirely materialistic in explanation, he says. The devil functioned either to explain gaps in our knowledge or as an ideological cudgel to demonize and discredit foes, as happens to Jesus, he says, in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 22 to 24. Interesting. But as modern science grew, the devil withered. Today, he has so little left to do that he has disappeared completely from every modern era of knowledge. I do not recall his making an appearance in any class in elementary school, junior high, high school, or college. And yet, says Dale, notwithstanding all this, multitudes, in other words, vast numbers of people in the West and presumably everywhere else, continue to have the experience of overwhelming evil and may posit as an explanation a supra-mundane cause, in other words, a supernatural element to it. How then should we think about the matter? One option, says Dale, is the reductionist path. Maybe the sense of horrific evil is neural flotsam, in other words, the brain, the unhappy byproduct of some blunder of the brain. Or maybe it is a not too distant relative of the so-called panic attack. So it's like a panic attack in some way. Or maybe it has an external invisible cause, such as low frequency sound, which can induce stress and produce unpleasant feelings. Not entirely persuaded by that. This is not, however, the sole option. Maybe God is not the only reality beyond our earthly cave. Maybe additional powers exist. Not all of them friendly. I seriously entertain this view, says Professor Dale Allison. And the last two paragraphs of this chapter that I'm reading, I will now share with you, and then we'll come briefly to the Islamic perspective in terms of the Qur'an and the Hadith. So he writes on page 46, "Those who believe that they have encountered otherworldly evil often find themselves with no one to speak to. Sometimes this is because their social world has no place for anything beyond textbook science. So speaking up might invite incredulity or ridicule. I'm sure this is true. In a conservative religious environment, by contrast, silence may be shrewd, may be wise, because some will imagine that horrible experiences are elicited by sin, or even that a sufferer is in danger of becoming possessed. Certainly true in some churches, I can imagine, particularly charismatic Pentecostal churches. They will quickly say, "Oh, well, you're obviously sinning. What are you doing?" Or they'll seek to exorcise you of evil spirits. But whatever the social or religious context, we should keep two facts in mind. First, although people may feel alone, they are not alone. The experience of an otherworldly horror is quite common, even today. There should be some relief in knowing this. Company is comfort. Second, there appear to be no clear-cut patterns regarding who has the experience or when they occur or where. Meret Demant Jacobson, who has made a special study of negative spiritual encounters, is impressed by, quote, the randomness with which people are suddenly faced by evil. Of course, there are examples of people being on the verge of mental illness or in severe depression, but they are few. Mostly, it is people who suddenly, waking up from sleep or walking in a wood, visiting a house and so on, are faced with a sense of evil that they cannot connect to a previous state of mind. The recipient of these negative experiences can often not connect them to any conscious choice and feels like the victim of random onslaught, end quote. Like the rain, horror falls upon the just as well as the unjust. This is simply part of being human, concludes Dale Allison from his book, Encountering Mystery. So, after those remarkable narrations, there are others in this book. We could spend hours recounting them, but I just want to briefly turn to Islam, as I said I would. What does the Qur'an say? And there's lots, by the way, in the Qur'an and in the Hadith literature, and let alone in other, in the Islamic tradition. And I'm not going to quote from most of it, obviously. Just a few verses in the Qur'an and a couple of Hadiths, that's it. You can Google this quite easily to find many, many more statements, authentic statements of the Prophet and verses from the Qur'an about Satan, about demons and his relationship with the human race. So the Qur'an says, quite explicitly, Satan is indeed a sworn enemy to humankind. Satan is indeed a sworn enemy to mankind, as in chapter 17, verse 53. It also teaches, quote, when you recite the Qur'an, seek refuge with Allah from Satan, the accursed. He certainly has no authority over those who believe and put their trust in their Lord. That's quite good news. He has no authority over those who believe and put their trust in God. And then I want to quote Surah 114. This is the final chapter of the Qur'an, right at the back. in English, and it's commonly used as a prayer against evil. It's a very powerful surah of the Qur'an. In English, I quote, "Say, I seek refuge in the Lord of mankind, the master of humankind, the God of humankind, from the evil of the lurking whisperer, who whispers into the hearts of humankind, from among jinn and humankind." End quote. And it sounds extraordinary in Arabic. If you listen carefully to the Arabic words, it's much more beautiful in that language. And then just a couple of hadith on shaitan, as he's called in Arabic, Satan. And there's a bit of advice here. I've already quoted this hadith, let's read it again, on how to repel the devil's whispering in prayer. Very useful for those of us who pray. Uthman came to the Prophet, upon whom be peace, and said, "O Messenger of Allah, Satan interferes between me, my prayer, and my recitation, confusing me." The Prophet said, "Such is Satan, who is called rotten. When you sense him, then seek refuge in Allah from him, and puff to your left 3 times. Uthman said, "I did so, and Allah took him away from me." And then in another narration, Ibn Abbas said, "Satan has perched over the heart of the son of Adam. If he is unmindful and he forgets, Satan whispers. If he remembers Allah, Satan withdraws." So remembering Allah, bringing taqwa, bringing to presence the consciousness and the fear of God is key here to repelling the advance of Satan. And very lastly, Abu Huraira reported, "The Messenger of God, upon whom be peace, said, 'Do not curse Satan, but rather seek refuge in Allah from his evil.'" Do not curse Satan, but rather seek refuge in God from his evil. And there we are. That ends the video on the reality, I would say, of demons. Just as in the previous video, there's plenty of evidence that angels have indeed visited us. We have guardian angels and they assist and help us many times in our lives. There is also the reality of evil, the evil presence of Shaitan and his minions, demons. They can apparently randomly come to us, but they can also tempt us. And they are, in fact, a sworn enemy to mankind. So we need to be vigilant, careful, and aware of that they exist and how to deal with them. And Islam has some very sophisticated technology, if I can use that word, or skills or information about how to protect oneself from evil and the evil one in all our areas of life. So there we are. Until next time.